Thank you everybody for coming and joining me today. And thank you very much for the invitation to share a few words. As I mentioned in my topic, I want to speak to parts of a chapter I wrote for a book recently. Now, the book is being produced by students of my teacher, like me, are all aging, but he passed away 40 years ago. So I was with him for 4.5 years, and I continued on in Korea for another 15 years. And so I was in Korea for 20 years. And during that time, I experienced many things, but some of the most profound experiences came out of the time that I spent with Master Kusan Sunim. He was a very humble man. He didn't mince his words or overspeak words. He spoke very few words. But what he did say was always very to the point, to relevant to each of us in regard to where our practice was at that time. So I'm going to read a little bit and also share more personal experiences in regard to practice. Firstly, I want to mention that when I first arrived at the temple in 1979, I had been practicing as a Theravada Buddhist and was a co-founder or supported the two founders of Wat Buddha Dharma. I was the attendant and the person who did a lot of work. And I also looked after Ilse Lederman, who became Ayakema, and Prakanti Palo. And then I went on my way to Japan. I went to Thailand and met some great teachers. And I went to Japan and did a what they call a Rohatsu retreat, quite a serious Zen retreat, which I describe in my chapter. And of course, if anyone would like to read this, please put your email in the link and it can be forwarded to you. But when I arrived in Korea, or particularly in Songwangsa, you would think it would be a shock to arrive in a country you have no language and you have no cultural identity with. I didn't even know any Korean people. I had to look up a little book on where Korea was and about the culture. But when I first arrived in this temple called the Temple of Vast Pines, Songwangsa, I had a distilling in my heart as if I had been there before. Everything became extremely quiet. And, just as I went through the gates, a great deep sense of joy as if I was coming home. So I will share a little bits as we go along about that actual experience. I just said here, walking slowly, I was taking it all in. The old trees and gnarled pines lined the river, and freshly fallen red and gold, delicious, deciduous leaves dotted the path. We stopped to bow again to tall steles, which are like big stone carving of the great teachers. And here it was the stories of the 16 great national masters. I was taken and introduced to my teacher very quickly. I met the two nuns that I was going to live with at that time, and they quickly dressed me in Korean clothing and took me to meet my master. Now, he was just in a very, very simple room, that papered doors, papered floors. They lived very simply. There wasn't really furniture, but he had one lovely a table. And so he started to make some tea and offered me tea and welcome me. And so I was feeling very much at peace when I met him. But the interesting thing in regard to him was, because there wasn't a direct language and everything was translated, was that the capacity to embrace you. And he did this with every single student. And I know many masters, many teachers have that depth of compassion that comes through their many years of practice and their wisdom that can be with anybody, whether you're rich or poor or famous or infamous, um, whether you're educated or not. They have the capacity to meet you where you are. And so when I met him, he began, after we'd had a cup of tea, to ask a few very simple questions. And at that time, I didn't really think how important these few little questions were, but they became a foundation for my practice. And he asked, what is this? What is this that has a body and has no mind? And what is it that has a mind and no body? I won't give you the answers, but things to reflect on. And this line of inquiry, it continued. And each time I was able to answer, and he would nod. And then he asked, what is it that has a strong body and a strong mind? You know, something that's very powerful. And I answered, a Buddha. And he smiled. And then he said, well, with this strong body and this very strong mind, what is the difference between you and a Buddha? And of course, in these moments when you hear something like this, you go into quite a deep reflection. Anything we don't know, we tend to withdraw back into a quiet state, into a place where we're searching for an answer. And there's not really an answer to a lot of these questions, but there's something that you can go on to discover. And I had been grappling with the idea or the notion of self and non-self from a very early retreat when I'd had an experience and something quite deeply had fallen away. And in practice, it's not what we gain so much in practice, but it is what we let go of, what we relinquish, that actually starts to grow in the presence of a deep wisdom and a deep knowing. So I asked him if this body and mind are empty, you know, in the sense I had the idea from my early practice and having just been in the retreat that, you know, the point was to come to a state of emptiness, shunyata or emptiness. And so where is this Buddha body and mind? And he very quickly fired back. Rather than try and give me an existential answer, he fired back with simply, well, who is asking? What is it that's asking this question? He tended not to use who as much in the personal sense of a who or a person as asking, but, you know, what is the mind? Where is this question coming from in our mind? And so for an endless sort of moment, an endless pause, I was, you know, absorbed in this moment of thinking deeply. And there was not an answer, but a stillness, a sort of a seamless, spacious stillness, a thisness, you might say, which is a word that I've come to use a little bit more in more recent years, a thisness about things. It is just this, but in a way, it embraced everything in that moment. And so the mind was silenced of words and thoughts and even feelings. And in that spaciousness, I was able to embrace myself, my teacher, and every body and everything in that moment. I began training, and I was just a novice sitting in a kitchen on a little stool, wooden stool, with a big tub of water filled with hot or cold water. And this action, this activity became my practice. Whether I was cleaning dishes or chopping vegetables, all these very ordinary everyday things, sweeping, wiping, whatever, talking even. Not that I had the language, so I had to use a more intuitive response and gesticulations to communicate. But I learned to just be present with whoever and whatever I was doing. because it became the thisness of those situations that was starting to become alive for me. So the body in the Son Buddhist community, the monks, there were 100 monks. There was about a dozen or so, maybe 2 dozen Western monastic. There was just, I think altogether there were about 6 Western nuns who actually lived in Songkwan Sarat, but just a few, 1 or 2 or 3 in the temple at any one time, because it was primarily a monk temple. And a few very simple things I started to realize is that whenever you met anybody, you always bowed. You put your hands together and you bowed. You connected in that recognition of a simple smile, a simple bow, whether it was to someone you knew or you didn't know. It was very much a Buddhist monastic practice, and for the lay people who lived in and around the temples. And so even when I first arrived back, I would be bowing to the birds and the trees and the flowers because I wasn't actually living with somebody else. So the things that were in my presence, in my environment, that's where I was paying my direct respect and honoring the nature that was part of supporting my life. It was always harder for Western monastics, particularly the nuns, because the monks could live, Western monks could live with the monks, but the nuns, we had a rather impoverished situation. Our room was patched, our clothes were patched, our socks and underpants were even patched. And I remember collecting the underwear of monastic who had left and boil them and dye them and wear them. And this was we would share our clothing. We would share whatever it was we had in a tiny room, 3 by 4, less than 3 by 4. There was always, between 2 and 4 nuns living in that room and sleeping in that room. And so the space was very small, but we never really felt impoverished. We didn't feel we were lacking. And we weren't envious because in a way we felt very fortunate to have that opportunity to live and practice with such a great teacher and with many other very great monks. We got up at 3 o'clock in the morning. We woke to the sound. All the day was full of various beats and chanting and instruments, So we'd wake it to the beat of this, what we call the wooden fish, and the sound, beautiful sound of a monk chanting, of deep sound. And when I was in the nun temples, it was the nuns chanting. And these times were marked by bells and gongs and ringing and dinging and booming, whatever it was, It was something that we knew what it meant. If it was time to have a meal, there was something to tell us it was mealtime. So we didn't actually need to have clocks or watches. We learned to live in this very natural way. Our room was very small. It was just, we had a little meditation hall just next to it, which just fitted 4 cushions in. But our room was small, so everything was brought out for a purpose and put away. And your clothes were also folded up neatly. We had a little box of our clothing for the season, a book or 2, and a tiny little table, which was really just 3 pieces of wood put together. And everything was put away, the room was cleaned, and the space was refilled or repurposed for what we were going to do next. And days went. We did go off and study in other places. I did go to study with the nuns in the meditation halls for 3 months at a time, twice a year. Summer and winter was retreat time, or I would spend that time back in Songkwan Sa with whoever was wanting to spend that season there. We had the opportunity. It was our choice to stay or leave. We began to develop the practice, the understanding of this practice, what we call a hadu. And this capacity to inquire into the self, inquire into the mind, the consciousness, the attentive mind, or the idea of whoever we think we are. This inquiry was what was called a whadu. So when I would reflect on, and that became the reflection, what is the same as me as a Buddha? What is within me? What is with the Buddha? And what is the differences? And it's very interesting. The more you go into this inquiry, we always have the image of the Buddha, we have the idea and the knowledge and all the teachings. But the Buddha is not something that was just embodied in a human form. It is something that through the enlightenment or the enlightened mind of this great teacher, it was present in everything. His capacity to be present in everything at any one moment, in the hearts of others, in the knowledge on how to teach, how to awaken people. So, it's clear I didn't have this capacity, but still there was a potential within me, as with others who had come and given up a lay life to become monastic and to live this life. It was a very difficult life to live in some ways, especially when you didn't have so much of the language or the culture. But also for the Koreans, it was difficult. And so what you are left with is, so much is stripped away. You're left with this core sense of a capacity, a belief, a faith that you too can become liberated, even as a woman. We did suffer some discrimination due to many, many reasons, and that I found lessened over the years. The monks became more and more accepting of me as another brother in a sense, or as another human being, and less about the outer form, or the fact I had different colored skin and different colored eyes. That seemed to become less. It was more about another practicing person. And that's very important for us to remember and to keep in mind. We all come from different backgrounds and we practice in different ways. But then how do we see other? How do we recognize and relate to something that's different or someone that's different? That is all part of our thinking, our illusory sense of this world. And the more deeper you go, then you also recognize the depth in others. So what is this? What is the difference? And what is this? It started to develop, firstly through subtler sensations of a not knowing. I said it's like drilling into that ground of being from where thoughts arose. But it became an actual essential tool, just as putting your shoes on or putting your clothing on. They're essential to keep you warm and keep your feet from getting hurt. But this was an essential tool for the mind. It created a sort of a framework in which I was able to think about things that are important. I was able to relate in a way that was more caring and more careful. And also what it did, it created an inference that was invoked by the what or the this, in a way that it was penetrating. It was removing anything that was not essential in the relationship of what I was doing in that moment. So rather than sit and you're cutting vegetables and dreaming about being back in Australia, no, you didn't have time to think like this. So you were developing the skillful means of your actions. You were developing a perceptible ability to see what is in front of you, taste what is in your mouth, and touch, what it is to touch. There's so many senses and sensations in touch. And when you do this, it dissolves conceptual duality, a conceptual way of thinking, and it creates a mind that is grounded far more in the nature of just being with things, in the natural relationship with the world. And that's not an easy, but it brings a great depth of peace and ease. And then it also brought with it a great sense of joy. There was less longing for something to appear or have, and more an acceptance of what is arising. And slowly, these views of the seer within the seer, the seer within the seen becomes it becomes empty. It empties. There is no seer in the seen. There's no speaker in the words. There's no hearer in the sound. And that is because the seen is such a magnificence, you might use in the beauty of what you see, but such a complex interrelational experience. There's no room for any self there. I had learned many years before that when I first started meditation and living at Wat Buddha Dharma, I could hear the highway, which was 20 kilometers away. I guess my ears were craving for something a little bit more than what I was experiencing at the times. But the capacity to hear without distinction is something that happens through meditation. On full moon nights, on full moon and new moon, we would have a bath day every 2 weeks. We would wash our clothes, and we would, in Korea, we often had cotton clothes, so they would be lightly starched, and we'd walk on them and iron them, and they would last for 2 weeks. So we'd have a bath day, and we would have an afternoon off on those days. So sometimes we went for a walk, sometimes we shared tea, but everything was light. When you're practicing, it was light. We were able to just be there with each other in that moment and enjoy it, or be in the forest walking and just being with the steps, just being with the breaths, just being with the birds, the sound of birds, and not trying to take the past moment into the next. The teacher would, on the full moon, the day after the full moon, he would offer a Dharma talk. And the Dharma talk is in a Zen way. It is like the Zen master comes up onto a podium, and he has a short poem, and he has a staff, and he introduces this inquiry through holding the staff and showing it to you, and asking, can you hear this, as he taps it on the ground. He's not just saying, can you hear it? He's saying, do you really understand this sound? Do you really hear it? Do you really hear the suffering of the world? The pain that Buddha talked about, great suffering is the innate condition in all of us. And why is it this way? And then he would give a little poem, which would be the prelude to his talk. Always something very beautiful, and should have put a little poem in here, but I forgot to. Anyway, there was always encouraging words at the end of his talk, which was, how to grow great faith or determination, great doubt. It's just Zen terminologies on how to grow that depth of commitment. And you do need to work hard at it. Whatever it is we're doing in life, we have to work hard at it. And the great doubt is this great sense of inquiry, this great sense of not really knowing that truth. And every moment when we can live in that space of not knowing, rather than all the things we know and all the things we think we are. When we open that door and we're suddenly this open being, that's, as the Buddha was such, he could meet any amount of difficulties and any amount of suffering and just bring compassion and wisdom to it. So after this Dhamma talk, he would invite the Westerners to come and have tea with him. And every time he would share in English. It was translated by a couple of the people who spoke Korean very well and had worked on, they had worked with him on presenting this talk in English. And one day we were gathered there, we'd had a cup of tea and we're sitting pleasantly, listening to his teaching. And at the end of the talk, a German monk, Haegong Snim, asked the master, "Is that," pointing to his hand, "the hand of a Buddha?" This was very interesting. The Kusan Snim reacted with a very Zen sort of way of teaching us all in that moment. If you say one thing is this, then what its relationship with another, are you making some sort of differentiation? So by saying, "Is that the hand of a Buddha?" Kusan Snim shot his foot up into the face of Haegong, and he said, "Well, is this the foot of a pig?" And we all, of course, were a little bit shocked. And then he took, Zen masters have a horsewhip. He took the horsewhip as if he was going to hit Haegong, and we all felt he might hit us, just in this moment of the sense of being one, with this student and with this experience. But then he started to say something which was really important, and I've never forgotten. We shouldn't pretend to know something just to be clever or important. Don't inquire about things that are not useful for your practice, or chat about superfluous matters. Don't mimic other teachers or masters by making gestures like raising your eyebrows or lifting fists or making strong words, unless you have a genuine experience. Or you have awakened to some truth, then whatever comes from your mouth will be truth. He said, these are senseless gimmicks. I can see, even if you don't open your mouth or blink an eye, whether your practice is ripened. And, we all, of course, when this little reprimand, you might say, had finished, we got up and left, and nobody said anything. We didn't discuss, oh, what did you think about that? Or no one said anything, or ever did. But when I was writing this chapter, I was reflecting on it. Because sometimes when we learn a lesson, it doesn't have to be so strong as such a reprimand. But when we learn something, the crack opens a little bit more light comes in, a little bit more wisdom enters into our hearts. And we realize something about truth, about integrity, about honesty. And you don't forget it. On a deeper level, we don't forget that. And then we become slowly more integral person. There was another occasion where I was personally reprimanded in a way. The retreat had finished and I wanted to go and have a little walk in the forest. The other foreigners had all left to do some errands or have a little break. And I approached my teacher and I bowed and asked if I could take some leave for the day. But he was trying to encourage me to continue to practice and to cultivate my mind. As the temple was quiet and empty, he said, "It's a very good time to meditate." Still, I had a bit of a stubborn determination, and I bowed and left. He wouldn't say not to, but, you know, even though I knew he was encouraging me to practice, I left. The walk in the mountains was refreshing. Yet on my return, I was tired and I didn't meditate that night, and I didn't feel so at ease. In the morning, he came and he motioned me to come to the field. We used to sometimes go with him to take rocks out of the field, and this day a cow was ploughing the field. And so we began to move the small rocks in silence. And then he crouched down and with a fist, he attracted the attention of the calf, who bolted over and he started to play. The little calf's was pushing against the fist. And I thought this was rather amusing. And then he looked up at me. Just one eye met mine, and I realized the stubborn butting head was my very own excessive determination. So still harboring a little guilt, I came back and I sort of decided I would sit in the afternoon. And I sat facing a newly papered lattice door. Every season we repaper the doors and the doors and the the windows. And it was sort of a midday light that was filtering through the paper, and it was very, very bright. It wasn't a speck sort of unnoticed. However, as it started to turn into the late afternoon, there was a softer glow. And this butting headed mind too had softened by this stage. And suddenly my attention fell on one tiny little less lit square in the door. And there was a sound of tuck, tuck, that sort of caught my eyes. I transfixed on this spot. And the third tuck pierced through those layers, the layers in my thoughts between me and my teacher, as a tiny little black beak retracted. There the light came through, and we met eye to eye. Beak retracted, and there was the little eye of the bird, a shiny black hole. Again, bound by trust, this followed through that tiny perforation, and I felt a universal light illuminating my whole being. So elated, the insight, it made me feel very bright and alive and happy. So I wanted to go and share that with my teacher, but then he too had left. So there was often something in the occasions of some insight arising, and they always say, as soon as you have an insight on those occasions, that's when you go to talk to your teacher. It's unlike in some traditions where you go often. We only go when we have really something to talk about. He was a great calligrapher. I'll just touch on one or two of these little stories, time's slipping by. He was a very great calligrapher. Many Zen teachers also have another Zen art. In his case, he was a wonderful calligrapher. And I also studied calligraphy and became interested in this art. But he gave me a few calligraphies. One was just a stroke, an outline of a figure. He called them Bodhidharmas, and he gave 1 to 3 nuns, myself. And the one with the strange head, he always thought my head was an interesting shape. He gave me this. But he wrote a little poem with it, and it says, "Sit as the smoke of burning incense as it enters the fragrance. Sit as smoke of burning incense as it enters the fragrance." So when you sit, your attention is just, anything in your mind is just sort of becoming that that fragrance. Watching the incense smoke rise, I entered more deeply into the pervading thisness of my Huadu. A thin stream of smoke rises straight and strong before tapering off, leaving just this fragrance. But then a thought arises. It wavers and circles again and again before it fades, leaving no fragrance. So this is something, thoughts are a little bit, they take you away. They take the energy away from what it is you're focusing on. And then when they're gone, they're faded, and the distraction has left you feeling some sense of alienation in the moment. You're not present with what it is. You've got to reconcentrate again to find what it is you're engaging in. The second calligraphy he gave me was on patience, and I'd long been pondering why a knife above the heart in the Chinese character, the character of the knife is above the heart. I'd wondered about this. The knife and swords, a symbol in Buddhism of wisdom, and I think in some of the other Indian traditions too. A deity wielding the wisdom sword slices away the ignorance in a single blow, exposing the innate compassionate nature within us. It is also the symbol of skillful means, such as a tool held in the hands of Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of compassion. These are useful aids to protect, teach, sever, and penetrate deeply into our hearts, alleviating painful karmic obstructions. Through patience, a more tender-hearted response has grown, and when things that divide us, they can fall away. I re-enter the fullness of this in this seamless connection. So it's a very interesting practice, the practice of patience. It's actually said to be the most difficult of all the parami. It's the middle parami after generosity and keeping your precepts and your vows. It takes great patience to do this, and great patience to develop the right effort, the right energy, and concentration and wisdom. But what it's doing in using the tools or using it as a symbol of wisdom to slice away ignorance, it is developing this skillful means that we can know how to benefit others and benefit situations through being patient with what is there, being patient with those who we don't understand or we disagree with. I said at the end, however, not being endowed with the skill of a surgeon, at times my knife is too heavy, too sharp, or too blunt. The last one I'll just touch on very briefly here because I touch on it somewhere else, I think. But it's of the big Enzo, the big circle. And the circle says, this thing, what is it? And that's the calligraphy under it. This thing, this round, luminous, flowing, empty circle of enlightenment. Something that every Zen or Buddhist student or people who have this calligraphy ponder. It's a turning word when we turn and penetrate into both this thing, such as a mind being the subject, and the circle as in an object, an empty object. It is awakened through a luminous flowering of the understanding of this within us when we empty that stillness and we empty out. I do touch on that somewhere else. Song Kwang Sa was changing, and my teacher had had a stroke a year before. And as old buildings were being rebuilt, he had promised that one of those buildings would become a hermitage site for the nuns. So one day he asked me and another nun to come up with him, and we followed up through a narrow track to an ancient rock wall. I knew this spot well, as I'd often sat in the small cypress grove above the wall. This site hadn't been inhabited for over 500 years, but for some reason, Sunim asked me to dig in a couple of damp spots. Tree roots were inhibiting the effort, and Sunim suddenly became tired, and he requested I carry him down the mountain. Given the circumstance, and with the help of Songil Sunim, I got him on my back, seated on the shovel, and then we slowly descended. Back in Samalam, the master's abode, I prepared a basin of warm water and washed his feet. Then, with the help of his attendant, took him inside. Sadly, it was clear his vigor was waning. Unfortunately, he didn't get to see the nuns' hermitage built. And it wasn't built quite in his way. He had great feng shui skills and other building skills, but still, it was a sturdy and traditional building. I called it Inwalam, the moon's seal, the seal of the moon. And it was my home for 14 years. Then we come on to this title of this story, which is called Sun Mind, Moon Mind. Insights Ripening. During the 1983 autumn free season, when only a few meditation monks were resident, Kusansnim asked if I could help attend him. He needed assistance during the afternoon walks to help him exercise a little and to sit with him in the afternoon. Also on occasions during the full moon phase, together with his attendant, we sat all night. At the stroke of midnight, I helped to take him outside and we walked in the courtyard. He showed me how to breathe in the moonlight, and we did a few Qigong exercises together before sitting again through the night. One evening, whilst reflecting on the effects of the moon and moonlight, I asked him, what is better, the moon mind or sun mind? He paused, looked at me intently and quietly answered, sun mind. There was a hesitation in his response, but no further elaboration. The notion of the sun-like mind arose from an earlier dissolution experience in meditation. It's where sometimes in meditation the body can dissolve and you're just in a luminous light experience of light. But here, years later, when contemplating how sunlight reflects on the moon's surface, creating moonlight, I recalled Kusansnim's response and possibly why he said sun mind. So the moonlight we see is actually only a reflection of the sunlight on the moon, and its surface becomes very luminous. I didn't know that, until, 15 years ago or 20 years ago. But then when I knew it, it resonated with this teaching. In states of concentration, such a moon mind, a luminous moon mind, a mind that's soft and luminous, is but just the reflective rays perceived through the sun mind's wisdom. So through our wisdom mind comes this soft, luminous mind. The wisdom creates the condition for the moon mind's luminosity, for its inquisitive, alluring embrace. And here I come back again to the calligraphy of Imoko's enlightened circle or Enzo. There is the appearance of luminance arising from the empty core. So the white paper shines with the with the black circle that you painted on it. So the paper becomes sort of like that luminance of that luminosity of the moon. And the function of the sun, such as the actual Enso circle, is a non-abiding sense of completeness or fullness. It represents completeness. One end of the circle meets the other. And it appears in this way that the core of it is empty. So because we can see a form, then also we can only see that form because it arises in space. It arises out of consciousness, rises out of a mind, out of a pure mind. If our mind is not pure or not clear, we cannot see things. If I'm looking at what's in front of me, such as the computer, I'm not paying attention to what's around me. I don't see that in that moment. So within this spaciousness, then things appear. So just as the karmic seeds of potential radiate from the moon mind's essential ground of being, karmic seeds of potential, they radiate. They're always radiating out, always coming into our conscious mind. But most of them, we don't actually, go any further with that thought. It just arises and passes so quickly. All the things that we've done, keep arising, the habits, the ideas. So if you reflect on this deeply, everything appears just due to a function in relation to what we call emptiness, or what we call a non-action. My teacher was passing away, or he's getting very sick, and he asked if I would go and study with a nun friend of mine. I think he possibly thought there are a lot of monks coming to the temple and he will have to be the Pangjang, the master of the temple again. But he was also aware that I would possibly suffer, if I were to be there when he passes away. And I agreed. And so when I was bowing to say goodbye, he gave me a big caddy with a small amount of tea in it. But the tea was very, very beautiful tea. I treasured that tea for a very long time. It was the best tea I'd ever had. And my parting words, I just settled into my practice when a call informed me Kusan Pangjang Snim's health was declining. Normally during retreats, there is no travel and we don't tend to go anywhere. Still, it was early evening when I entered Kusan Snim's room. His two attendants were there, and I bowed slowly and offered my concerned regards to these attendants who sat near him. Snim looked comfortable. He was sleeping. I observed his strong breath and gentle snore as I spoke. His breath became quieter as if he was listening. I thanked him for his compassionate care and guidance and vowed to stay a nun and continue my practice. I mentioned my retreat was going well, then spoke of a dream I'd had the previous night. We were traveling on a path together, then at a fork, he pointed and said, "You go that way. We'll meet again." I asked, "Can't I come with you?" He simply said, "Go well." Holding back tears, I offered these parting words. This morning I saw 3 white rosebuds, begin to bloom, and it was snowing. They are now sitting together with me in a vase. I bowed slowly and slipped out into the dark. Though sad, my heart was full of gratitude for all the kindness and the teachings he had shared. And the 3 white roses remained in in buds throughout the winter. I had noticed at his memorial the orchids also bloomed in the chill of winter. And then we had the funeral, and the funerals are they're very beautiful, but they're a very big event, and they go on for many days with visitors coming, and we serve the visitors. And then on the day of the cremation, the casket is all covered in flowers and carried down through the village. And monks and nuns from all over the country come with and write on these beautiful silk banners, poems and stories, memories, and words and teachings. And there's a big line of monks and nuns following the casket and all chanting Namo Amitabha, which is, the Pure Land. Usually they chant for the monastic, to spend a little time in the Pure Land before they come back. And then when we went up the hill with the casket, there's already preparations to burn. It's a big pyre that they put the casket on and then light the sticks, or the big actually lumps of wood. And everyone calls out, Sunim, Sunim, leave your body now. The fire is burning. Come back swiftly. And it reverberates through the crowds of people. As the fire burnt slowly through the misty night, we Western disciples huddled together around the smouldering pyre, reminiscing how we had shared our loving thoughts and our memories about this spiritual fatherly figure who had transformed our lives. Kusan Sunim gave his last most important teaching that night. As his body was returning to ash and bone, someone uttered his words, "Can you understand now? Originally, there is no birth and no death." I had heard this. Occasionally, he would ask us, have you reached the state of no birth and no death? And what does this mean? What does it mean to not die and not be born? If something, we have a breath or something arises, we know it's going to pass away, whatever it is we're perceiving in this conscious moment. But if we breathe in and we breathe out, but we don't breathe in again, we know also this is the end of this physical life that we have come to know as Jigwan, all of you. And it's a reflection. So I'm just going to finish this last little line here. His bones were beautiful rainbows. He had pearl speckled teeth, and coloured relics were, hundreds, little tiny specks of coloured relics. And they're all retrieved from this fire pit. Some of the bones were crushed between roofing tiles and together with the ash were put into small white paper pouches. And we scattered them. All the students came and we went over the mountains and we scattered them where he once had a hermitage. And the rest of the relics were put into his, they make a pagoda, stupa. It's called a stupa. So I won't go in any further with this story, but what I did notice is after he passed away, there was a deep sense of caring for one another, a deep sense of what I've lost, you have lost. What I've understood, you've also understood. And so that great brotherly and sisterly caring was very, very notable and still, I think, continued until this day. And this year I'm going back to Korea to share that his memorial once more. So the 40th, this will probably be his last memorial. We're all getting a little bit old. Not many of us will go for another 10 years in the capacity to travel to Korea. So it'll be a very special occasion. And that's why I wrote this chapter to share. And I wanted to share it with you because I think there is quite a lot of insight which might relate also to your own practice in some way or another. At least I hope it does. So thank you for listening and staying with it. And may it bring you, on some levels, some depth of wisdom and understanding.